Welcome one, welcome all. Thanks for tuning in to the Politics of Cinema, the place where cinema and politics go hand in hand. My name is Aaron Spears.
And I'm Isaac Miller. And for our second season, we're going through the 1960s as we track the great transition in cinema and politics. Today, we're checking in with Japan and the Japanese New Wave.
Smoke all 7 filter cigarettes. You'll find some too strong, some too light.
Still love a man. He worked in a mine, Lord.
Boys in person will be at the Fairgrounds Coliseum Wednesday.
So this is one of our diversion episodes, Isaac. We chose a couple of countries to take a look at in the same time period as American cinema's great transition in the 60s. I gotta say, you were very, very insistent that Japan would be included.
Yes.
Why was that?
Because 60s Japanese film is absolutely incredible. I mean, 50s Japanese film is absolutely incredible. I mean, it's, you know, pound for pound. I mean,
and the 40s Japanese films are incredible.
It's just like, I don't know. Like, it's really hard to, I mean, it's actually, I think pound for pound is pretty hard to top them, right? Like, think about this. You have art movies that are as daring, as interesting as anything going on anywhere else. You have peak samurai genre. You have, you know, some of the, which are also oftentimes incredible art movies. Yeah. You've got possibly the best noirs outside of classic 40s and 50s American stuff, who, you know, and Yakuza films. You've got you know, goofy Godzilla stuff and monster movies. You know, like, it's just, the thing about it is it's really diverse and really good, right? Like, it's not just like we're going through a new wave period. It's like, no, it's all fun.
It really is. And I gotta say, like, Japanese cinema is one of those that I've read a little bit about. I didn't really get too much into in film school because none of the professors that I had really concentrated at all on Asian cinema in any way. But what I've seen, I've loved. And as you kept sending me more recommendations for their amazing film noir, which we actually talked about in one of our COVID comfort cinema. See our back catalog for that one. That are amazing. And the more I watch of them, the more I want to watch more of them. It's a very enticing cinema culture that's come through in Japan over the years, and also because it's wildly diverse, like you were just saying. I don't even think of the stuff we're talking about today. Like, there isn't a monster movie from the 60s that we're looking at, and there isn't a samurai film from the 60s that we're looking at, although we could have.
I mean, let's just put it this way. This is scratching the surface. We will be going back to this well. I mean, obviously Japanese film, not just in the 60s, but there's actually some more 60s stuff we'd like to do with. I'd like us to do pick some samurai movies. I think
we'll get there.
Well, what I was going to say is we are, I think, hopefully before the year is over, separate from this series, we're going to do Harikiri and the films of Kobayashi, The Human Condition, you know, because this is a podcast about politics in cinema, and his films are incredibly political and also incredible.
Well, I think also the upfront nature of the films that we're going to be talking about today, but also just I mean, my list of stuff I want to watch from the 60s from Japan is at probably like 50 some titles, and that's just on Criterion. Actually, you even pointed out to me that there's like over 120 Japanese films on Criterion Channel right now just from the 60s.
Right.
Which says a lot.
Just to compare that, also there's like 83 from 83 French films from the 60s. And I think part of what's going on there is exactly what I was talking about. It's like, yeah, you're getting the art films, but you're also getting, they're putting on all of the Godzilla films, and they're putting on the samurai movies. They're talking, the Splatterfest stuff, and horror movies, the whole thing. And you're not really doing that for French cinema in the same way.
Right.
And I think part of it is that I think we can have a very Western centric view of culture, but of course Japan is. We're talking about the global capitalist economy. Japan is a core economy. And the 1960s is a period of takeoff where they're growing at 10%. They'll be growing at 10% a year for several decades until they start sputtering out in the late 90s in terms of GDP growth. But it's so I mean, this to sort of contextualize it is like, but they're a cultural powerhouse that has shaped global culture in immeasurable ways. If you combine the influence of anime and the influence of Kurosawa alone,
oh sure.
It's just, it's absurd, but, you start digging deeper and it just goes more and more. And if you add Godzilla in there, it's just,
Right. Well, there's also the element of, so like when I referenced the Covert Comfort Cinema episode we did, that was British film noir, They Made Me a Criminal, and then the Japanese film we looked at, both immediately post-World War II films, one from UK, one from Japan. We did Drunken Angel, the Kurosawa film, and the Japan that you see in that one versus the Japan that you see in these films in the 60s, I mean, it's a different world.
Right.
Which is really, really fascinating. So again, comparing this with our previous episode on France and the French New Wave from this Summer of 60s series we're doing, France gets the spotlight. Like they have, a new wave because you have a declared movement, from the filmmakers themselves, from the press, because they were critics. So like they declared their intentions and then they went out and they made the films, and they did quite a splash. One, because you also have a gigantic film festival in France that was already chugging along that could be a showcase for this national cinema, which you don't necessarily have in Japan in the 60s. There are some festivals going on, but not quite to the level that you got, the Cannes Film Festival, just with one right there. But this is like, it's an amazing film movement, and it's very much informed by a reaction culturally, politically, and artistically to World War II. Very similar to the French. There's this obsession, fascination, whatever you want to call it, with youth, with the young. Right. And that really comes through in some of the films we're talking about today, but also we've seen more than just the few that we're talking about today. So like you said, scratching the surface, lots of interesting themes here. I can't believe this isn't more well-known. And I don't know. There's a lot more digging to do into just Japanese films of the 60s, to be honest. Like my list is growing, even though we're going to be moving on with our next few episodes. This is clearly a deep, deep well.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think the themes that you find have to do with the effects of World War II. I think the Kurosawa that we looked at was immediately afterwards. One of the movies that we're not covering, but I'll just mention, which is a very, very early new wave for them, is Pigs and Battleships, which is, as absurd as it sounds, it's a Yakuza movie. It involves pig farming and illegal trading and relations and prostitution with involving a U.S. naval base right at place. So it's like the looming presence of the United States through the 50s and 60s is always there. But also, as we go through the 60s, the movies that we're looking at, you see other political themes coming up as well.
Well, they hit on a lot of stuff too that we're going to see come up in American cinema. And also, again, we're looking at this with historical perspective. So like, we can see that this came out this year, this came out that year. I don't know offhand when or if any of these films made it to American theaters in the 60s at all or not, or was it, purely released in Japanese theaters, or I don't know how culturally widespread they were. But again, looking back from history, these are of massive historical significance, and the reverberations we'll mention as we talk about here, like they're clearly influencing filmmakers that are still, turning out films today.
I mean, the obvious stuff is like, you don't have Spielberg or Lucas or whatever, but do you have Tarantino? Do you have any, do you have...
Right.
Do you have New Hollywood? Do you have, it's kind of doubtful that it would be anything like it would be.
You're right. I don't think it would be at all. I find it also really fascinating because this movement in Japan and the Japanese New Wave, as it's called, isn't like a reaction because they saw the French New Wave films and were like, oh, we need to do that. Like this is a concurrent, simultaneous movement that's popping up because of the cultural, political, and artistic mood in two different countries. And I'm sure, I mean, if you go over to, Poland, you can go to other countries too and see that there is this really interesting, almost like World War II allows for like a cultural and artistic reset, and politically to a certain extent too, for boundaries to be pushed, new things to be tried out. And
the delegitimization of old orders.
Yeah.
And also that this is a period, this is a complex period of both unrest and prosperity through almost every country that we're talking about. One thing to remember, we haven't really talked about this. I didn't set this particular stage, so we're just going to do it randomly on the Japanese episode. But, Japan is growing at an incredible rate. But this is the period up into the late 60s, which is sort of the glorious period, right? In terms of economic growth and prosperity, which as you look at sort of the Black experience in the United States, it's deeply uneven. But this is the ideal that we look back to in the United States. It's the 50s and 60s and early 60s sort of breadwinner.
Oh,
but
yeah,
that is true everywhere. Even if you're looking in the global South, and this is the period of decolonization and everything, they have higher growth rates and like developmental states and things like that, which, are going to fall apart in the 70s and not work out. This is a total digression.
No, but it totally fits in because we don't have the time to go into it, but like throughout the 60s too, like Latin American cinema is experiencing a very similar boom. Throughout most of the functioning film worlds of South America have very similar things where it's like an obsession with the youth, declaration of throwing off the old guard, in a lot of cases, colonial powers, and they want to assert their own culture within film.
And this is like the theme of this entire podcast. This is a reflection of the politics of that moment, of a moment of upheaval. And, to parallel it with our own moment, we're in a moment of upheaval. We're in a moment of global protests, really for the last 10 years, wave of them. But once again, without as coherent a set of politics. And
currently you're saying?
Yes.
A
reference points there are common reference points across the new left. I'm going to use that term for the first time, and we'll talk a little bit more about it when we talk about especially Night and Fog in Japan.
I want to set the stage as well with some of the themes, because we mentioned it when we did the French New Wave episode, and just to show that this is not like an inspired by the French New Wave, although there is going to be some, inspiration and cultural exchange, I guess, as we go on. But these films, the Japanese New Wave kicks off in the late 50s, the exact same time period as the French New Wave. And for context, Breathless, Jean-Luc Godard's film, comes out in 1960. Foreigner Blows is 59, I think, the year before. So at the exact same time, the films we're talking about are taking off in Japan. So like they were in production, they were shot, they edited. They're coming out at about the same time, and they focus on pretty similar themes. There's a lot of social outcasts as your protagonists, which include what you would traditionally say, criminals or delinquents. A lot of youth-oriented main characters here, protagonists. There's very uninhibited sexuality in a lot of these Japanese films that I wasn't quite expecting, because I'm used to the American films of the early 60s we've been looking at so far. And the amount of nudity and sexuality is pretty refreshing to see in a lot of these Japanese films. The role of women in society is really interesting in the way it's represented in some of these films we're going to be talking about today. But again, just scratching the surface, I assume it's probably going to be across the board. The ideas of racism and ethnic minorities in Japan are directly addressed in one of the films we're looking at today. And I'm assuming that would be holding true again of other films of the time period. But like you said, it's a deconstruction of a lot of traditional social structures, and assumptions are also going on in these films, which feels like a reaction when you have a global cataclysmic event. Like, I don't know, your country had 2 atomic bombs dropped on it just, a few years earlier. Kind of allows for, I don't know, it seems like a bit of, it just seems like a massive reset button. When you're rebuilding that much of your infrastructure and of your own, of the country, I don't know, it puts you in a mindset that I can't quite get my head around, because that's a direct experience I don't have.
Well, and we talked about this last episode in the sense that you can see this in a lot of European film. And then last episode, we talked about The Pawnbroker, which is about the after effects of that, the horrors of World War II and the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
Which just isn't going to show up in American film in the same way, outside of like incredible amounts of violence later in the decade. I think, well, and there is a sense, and you get this in the 50s as well. This is definitely true in Kurosawa, and it's true in Kobayashi, and probably a lot of other movies, where the old order has been has been delegitimated. And Kobayashi's a leftist. Kurosawa, I don't think really is. But the movies we're looking at right now are explicitly that, and
right.
are dealing with leftist movements.
Well, and then the last thing just to wrap it up was, again, because like in my head, I was like, holy shit, like I can't believe this wasn't a huge chunk of my film school education being Japanese films from this time period specifically, but fucking any of it for all that matter. Outside of like Ozu and Kurosawa, like we just kind of got like a couple of the greatest hits and that was it. And we moved on. But again, so like comparing it to France originated from almost exclusively from outside the industry to a certain extent, from outside the traditional, Hollywood of France. This in Japan actually kind of originates and launches from within the traditional film industry. Like they were looking at trying to get more youth into the theaters. It was the idea of like, there's a threat from TV, there's a threat from other elements of culture pulling people away from the movie theaters and appealing to the young with, the social outcast, the sexuality, the role of women, directly addressing racism and ethnic minorities in Japan is appealing to the young. It's appealing to this feeling of change of, the political left as well. And it works for the most part within these films and becomes popular. And because it is financially successful, it does continue through the 60s.
Yeah.
So do you want to jump in with Seijun Suzuki and Branded to Kill, and then we'll move on to Oshima after that?
Yeah.
Or do you want to do a chronological order here, or?
No, let's start with Branded to Kill because it's a very different. Let's just say that the Oshima is of a piece. Let's say
that's true.
And Branded to Kill is not overtly political, whereas Night and Fog in Japan and Death by Hanging, those are two movies, are.
Very, very much. So we're not doing a huge deep dive on any of these movies, but just to these are 3 strong recommends, obviously coming from us here. And there's plenty more out there, but if you're not familiar with Branded to Kill, it is I would say kind of a deconstruction of film noir, but we'll just call it a film noir for the sake of brevity. So after a badly done assignment, a hitman finds himself in conflict with his own organization and one mysterious and dangerous fellow hitman in particular. In this particular movie, there's a hierarchy for hitman. There's literally a number 1. It's a ranking system. There's literally a number 1, a number 2, a number 3, a number 4. And hitman number 1 is out to get our main character. I don't know how else to summarize. I mean, that's the basic summary of the movie. It kind of defies explanation to a certain extent.
You know what actually just hit me about this is not something to jump on, but the ranking system there, and there's other Japanese movies from this period where I'm trying to remember the name of it. There was one I was watching part of where there's like an assassin system and there's rankings and stuff. There's a real like, I think there's a echo in John Wick and the John Wick world building.
Oh, yes. But you are correct, sir.
This is part of what's amazing about this movie is you have this stone cold killer, seemingly very efficient hitman who at the beginning of the movie is doing a favor for another hitman who's hard on his luck by doing a job with him, who needs to get back into the business.
Yeah, trying to reestablish himself.
Right. Turns out the reason the guy isn't is because he's an alcoholic who's totally lost his nerve. Our guy is hyper competent. He's number 3, right? And I think kills number 2 and 4, or at least number 2, I think, during it. He sets the guy on fire in a pillbox, which is a pretty good kill. And then when he gets screwed up, which he's actually set up with a butterfly. She screws up his aim so he misses by having a butterfly land on his gun.
He's so precise that he's got it in the crosshairs, and he's got the wind, he's got everything under control, and he's compensated for everything, and then a butterfly lands in the barrel of his gun. Literally like the effects of a butterfly wings, the butterfly effect. Just enough weight to throw it off, and he kills an innocent bystander, an innocent tourist. Right,
which is against the rules. And then you see his descent and spiral, and
he becomes an alcoholic and loses his nerve.
There's deeper themes in this movie that I'm just not able to quite pull out at this moment.
Well, what we're describing sounds like it could be a Hollywood film noir from the late 40s, 50s. there's far more stylized violence and also nudity and sexuality than you are expecting from this description. You also get unbelievably gorgeous cinematography. And there's repetitive visual themes of like I said, the butterfly, that comes up several times throughout the whole thing. Like it's a visual motif that Suzuki goes back to again and again and again. That is not even to say anything about the editing style of this film that puts, you can compare this to, in my opinion, frame by frame with Breathless as a deconstruction of film noir tropes and stereotypes. And I think this movie even does it better. And I'm a huge fan of Breathless and Godard. But this just has Godard all over it, I thought.
Yeah, well, part of it is whereas Godard has this playfulness or this meta-ness that actually kind of drives me crazy. This is a deconstruction, but it also functions as that story and does the action and everything else.
Yeah,
extremely well. And, I mean, at the end, he ends up dueling it out with number one. I don't want to actually give away the end because...
Well, I think it's criminally underseen, as all of these movies are.
Right, it's criminally underseen. I mean, basically, you slowly see him fall apart as the number one stalks him. Probably could have killed him earlier, but basically, this is how number one works. And just slowly sort of just, drives him insane by laying siege to him in his apartment and not letting him out, except for brief points where he is somehow able to get out. It's really wild. And then
I think it goes back to your John Wick comparison, actually, which I hadn't. I know you're a bigger fan of that series than I am, and it didn't occur to me while I was watching it at all. But as soon as you said that, I was like, holy crap, this really like there's a code there. Then even when he's literally arm in arm with number one, at one point they're like living together in his apartment, and they just agree to like leave the gun on the table, and he knows that number one's going to kill him, but number one hasn't decided how yet. And there's still, well, I mean, it even shows up in some of the samurai films. Like there's a code of honor amongst fucking killers that I feel like they're playing up almost to comic effect in this movie.
Well, one of the things, if you watch, it's the same director. If you watch Tokyo Drifter, which I would also strongly suggest, loads of fun, really great. And actually, I think I mentioned Pigs and Battleships, which is a very, very early New Wave movie. I mentioned it earlier. Both of those are movies. And actually, if you even think about like Drunken Angel, a lot of what they're doing is, the Yakuza is supposed to have this code, right, that keeps everything going. And you can say that about like the mafia, like in American films.
Sure.
But what all three of those movies, the code is bullshit. And they sort of go after the code. In this, he's being double-crossed and he's being set up. But you actually are not supposed to kill civilians, and he does get in trouble. He is actually in trouble for that. I think they stick to their code even while double-crossing him.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
I think this might be the first Yakuza movie where I've watched where they actually do that.
They stick with it.
They actually, most of the time,
honor the code.
Most of the time, the point is that they don't.
Right. So I alluded a little bit to the editing style in this one, and it's one of those things that we're in an audio medium, so it's really hard. Well, first, we can't play clips of anything because nobody's going to understand what the fuck anybody's saying. I'm presuming we don't have a lot of Japanese speakers in our audience, but it's such a visual film that it's hard to describe the editing style here, but it's unlike anything I've seen from this time period. And all the films that we're going to discuss today in this episode have their own unique visual language and editing style that I think just speaks to the riches coming out of Japanese cinema in this time period. Instead of just having a transition where it's just a hard cut to the next scene, it's almost like a shuffle cut in a montage where part of the audio from scene A bleeds into scene B, and then the visuals overlap a little bit too. And I'm not describing this too well. It's not disorienting, and if you kind of go with it, it flows because it connects visual motifs from scene to scene to kind of connect the narrative, and the editing almost like it creates the pace for the movie, which is that's what editing does, but it also like leads the audience through the narrative and pushes the narrative forward in a really I don't know, it's a really interesting way. I could see someone feeling very disoriented by it at first and just kind of tuning out. But if you just go with it and let the film kind of wash over you, it creates this really, really interesting and kinetic mood.
Yeah.
As you're watching it.
No, I would tend to agree. I think, I mean, describe. No, that is about as good as you're going to get for describing the filmmaking style.
I mean, in an audio form. Otherwise, I would just play some clips and be like, "Yeah, look at this! Isn't this amazing?"
Right.
It's just visually stunning. Again, it's a film noir, and it's shot as such. Like there are really amazing we should also say it's black and white because not all films from this era are black and white. But it's got like really great high contrast photography. Like the blacks are deep, rich blacks, and the whites are like shockingly bright. And like the night scenes, like it's all the stuff you'd expect from a film noir. It's all there in just gorgeous cinematography.
I mean, it's such a noir that it actually has a femme fatale.
Yep.
Who is the assassin?
Kind of a couple in an interesting way.
Well, yeah. So there's his wife, who is, I mean, who they have very kinky and pretty graphic sex a lot. And then,
I don't know how kinky it is, but there's okay. Actually, this thing's really good. This is a good example for editing.
They've got some stuff going on there.
They've got some stuff going on, but there's a scene where they have a montage sex scene fairly early in the film between he and his wife when they're reunited. He's thinking of another woman, the femme fatale, and that's what gets him all horned up and ready to go. And then he gets home to his wife, and they keep having sex in all these different places around their apartment. Again, very very graphically, but also very passionately. It's not like exploitative, I don't think. It's very, very passionately represented and filmed on screen, but they keep cutting to the bed that they're not using. So it's not just some sort of like titillating sexual scene. It's actually saying something within the editing too, where like they're having, okay, logistically, it seems like it would be very hard. I've never had sex on a spiral staircase, but they do in this movie and in this scene. And I'm just like, how the fuck would that work? That seems so uncomfortable. And then they cut to an empty bed. And then they're like on the floor in the living room. And then they cut to the empty bed.
Right.
So it's not even done in it's not even shot in a traditional way, but it's also saying something in the editing, which is, again, that's back to like montage theory and, Marxist film theory and Soviet editing styles at the turn of the century. So he uses those techniques to tell the audience something that the characters aren't even aware of in that scene.
So this just occurred to me when we were talking about the wife, is the other Wickianness. And so here's it should be very clear that this is profoundly unlike John Wick. If you go to watch this movie and think that it'll be tonally anything like John Wick, it is not. We're just saying that the world it's describing. But part of what's interesting about the wife is that she's totally part of this world. In fact,
right.
Spoilers, she tries to kill, she's one of the first people who tries to kill him and then goes and sleeps with his boss, which is a very film noir thing, actually. Like you could find that in a regular film noir plot. And he ends up being with the femme fatale, and then the femme fatale gets kidnapped by his bosses, and then, so on and so forth. All of this is actually sort of classic film noir stuff, but it doesn't feel like it at all, because the way that it's put together and the way that his inner drama is presented, the way that his psychology, the way that Joe Shishido, who plays our hero here, who's, an incredible tough guy, right? Like he plays that so well. And if you see another movie from him from, I think, the same year, I think, what is it? My Colt is My Passport, or A Colt is My Passport.
Colt is My Passport.
Where he plays the tough guy straight. He's really great at it, but what he does a wonderful job of here is deconstructing that tough guy, right?
Yeah.
Is having him fall apart and making it believable. I mean, I think, part of it is that he actually does an incredible acting job of just bringing this, and it helps if you've seen him in other things where he's just stone cold.
Well, and what you mean by like deconstruction of it is, as it starts off, he's the guy in the sunglasses, and he's the cool, calm guy, and like you said in the first scene, he's with a formerly ranked killer who wants to get back in the game, who's the drunk fuck up, and then you slowly see him he doesn't have the glass anymore, his hair's more disheveled. Now he's the paranoid one because he can't figure, like, number one is playing mind games with him where he doesn't know what's coming next or where his enemies are even at, or when he might be taken out at any point in time, and you slowly see him become more and more disheveled. So yeah, like he starts off playing like the classic film noir badass that he has played before, and even in the same year, like you said, with The Cold Is My Passport.
I mean, the depths that he ends up. Well, part of it is I love toward the end. Well, it's the psychological like descent, and then he doesn't just descend though. He also, yeah. So this is the only time you're going to hear me do this, where it's like, I'm not giving this away, but he rallies. What I love about it is, and this is very true, is like he's rallying from his lowest point. He's still a goddamn mess. He doesn't pull it together, unscruff himself, take a shower, and go out and be a badass. He's still a giant mess when he goes in and like pulls himself together, because he's an incredibly good killer, but he's not actually under control. So
because everyone's been psychologically tormenting him for days at this point. So like he's at the end of his psychological rope almost.
Right, but he's still able to pull it together, and you believe it because you've seen the first part of the movie.
Yeah.
I just
because you know what he's capable of.
You know what he's capable of, and I can't do it right now. I sort of want to rewatch and work through that arc a little more carefully, because I think there's nothing here that isn't motivated in what's happening, but I think it's actually a really subtle arc of where he ends up when he decides to. I'm going to be number one. He'd given up. I think part of what it is that he's given up on being part of this world. As soon as he fucks up, he's just given up on it, and he decides, I'm going to go back in, but I'm still a giant mess.
Well, because he broke the code, like you're saying. Yeah, he fucked up. He broke the code. Ah, shit. Now, there's no way back in for me. But he's got the instincts and he's got the training. He can.
Right.
I wanted to mention in production-wise, because again, I'm watching this stuff with like my jaw on the floor, going like, holy shit, like why haven't I seen all 120 of these movies on Criterion? Every one that I'm watching is amazing. It makes me want to watch more, which is, a great feeling. Like it leaves you wanting more. But in my head, I was like, God, this is so connected. Also because of the series we're recording right now, it's so connected to the French New Wave in my head. Also because, again, it's running concurrently with the French New Wave at the same point in time. Reading up a little bit about how this movie was made. So Suzuki came in and to this film, and one particular thing I read is so Godard. I was just like, holy shit! Like these are contemporaries at this point. So Suzuki didn't use any storyboards and disliked pre-planning. Period. Especially going into this film. So he was coming up with ideas that we were either like the night before or on the set. Because as he put it, the only person on set who should know what's going on is the director, which also kind of sounds like Hitchcock. See our Birds episode for discussion on Hitchcock's working methods. But that sounds like a terrible collaborator if you're an actor. You're like, wait, I'm just getting, what's the scene tomorrow? I don't know. I'll tell you in the morning. That's when we're shooting.
Are you saying the actors looking like they're falling apart is actually just...
I mean, maybe just play to his strengths. It sounds like this is a recipe for a fucking pile of a movie, but he got this brilliant film out of it. So it's pretty amazing. So he felt that sudden inspiration would really make the picture. And I feel like he's right in this particular case. And I think it's on screen. Like that kind of energy, that kind of spontaneity is there on the screen. And you can get it in many different ways. He happened to get it by, coming up with stuff on the fly. Luckily at this point, this isn't his first film either. Like, I was comparing with Godard and Breathless being his first feature film. This is a well-trained, I mean, this is a professional, this is a pro at this point.
Right.
And I think it shows on screen too. I did see a note as well that Jim Jarmusch specifically thanked Suzuki and specifically Branded to Kill in the credits for Ghost Dog Way of the Samurai. And that makes perfect sense to me.
That makes an immense amount of sense. And also makes me want to watch Ghost Dog again, but
it really does. And there's other people too. If you just do, Branded to Kill, film influences, you've got, like the Tarantino's out there singing his prayer. Like this is a well-known cult film. However, when he turned it in, when he first made this movie for Nikatsu Studios, very famous studio system at the time, and also kind of a fostering ground for a lot of the Japanese New Wave directors, he was fired. He screened the film and they're like, get the fuck out, you're done. We wanted a quickie Yakuza film. They even had a template of like, a certain number of days for prep, 20 days shooting, 3-day post-production, get the stuff out there. Not exactly, I mean, I guess comparatively to like Corman and what Corman was doing at AIP to a certain extent. But yeah, he screened this one. The powers that be at the studio were just like, you're fired. See ya. And didn't realize quite what it was. I don't think audiences did either. I'm not sure this movie was a huge hit, but it definitely has gained cult status over the years and found a resurgence in 1980s repertoire theaters in America, and also the home video craze of VHS in the 80s definitely helped as well, which I'm sure is where the Jarmushes and the Tarantinos of the world were first running across this film.
Do you want to close this out and move on to our other two features?
Yeah, time for some Oshima. Which one do you want to? Do you want to go chronological?
Let's go chronological, and let's start with Night and Fog in Japan.
Oof. I'm just going to go with the IMDb synopsis. If you haven't heard of Night and Fog in Japan from 1960, directed by Nagisa Oshima. Long takes and highly theatrical visual approach combined to form a tense and confrontational look at the decline of a socialist student activist movement in Japan. Is that accurate, Isaac?
I mean, I would say that's accurate. I mean, I think the thing to remember here, after doing a little bit of reading, is this is a film which is from 1960s, so he doesn't know this is what's happening. But this is the transition between the Japanese old left and new left. And the transition from the old left to new left is something that happens basically all over the world. It happens in Britain. You may find the left-wing journal, academic journal, New Left Review still exists, right? And, obviously it's, I think we mentioned in an earlier episode, the pro-Huron statement. So this is a transition from the Stalinist, Soviet Union-oriented communist parties to an anarchist or Trotskyist or other sorts of third worldist influenced radical movements that dominate in the 60s. Not that the Stalinists ever completely go away, and also a lot of Maoism. So I don't know about Japan specifically in that context. And so this is a movie, without knowing a huge amount about the Japanese left, and I confess I don't, it is excruciating because it's incredibly recognizable. If you know anything about Stalinism and how it works, what is going on in this film is instantly recognizable and deeply painful, and all of the really horrific things outside of the Soviet Union, where there's like Stalin actually killing millions of people, but the ways that the fact that the Soviet Union is there to support the left and creates the legitimacy from the October Revolution, which means that it becomes dominant and it sort of gives the left an edge, and yet is deeply self-destructive because of the cult-like rigidity and bureaucratic tendencies. This is something you find all across the line. And the other thing that you find across the line, which you see in this movie, is how these movements tied to Moscow end up having to follow the line of Moscow. But Moscow's line is not based on what's important to them. It's based on Soviet foreign policy. The most notorious example of this is the Communist Party in Germany in the early 30s not allying with the Social Democrats against the Nazis, which means the Nazis come to power. And they're following the Soviet Union based off of Stalin's internal maneuvering within the Soviet government. It's, an unbelievable disaster. And you see some of that here. Anyway, that's just to sort of set the stage. The one other thing about it, what's interesting about choosing it, and we're choosing it because it's a great movie and it's very political and it fits our themes. It's not actually a 60s movie.
No. I mean, it's made in 1960, and for what it does filmically, it's groundbreaking for 1960. But you're right. So the framing device amongst this plot is like there's a wedding going on, and all of these different activists kind of are confronting each other at this wedding. And it's full of flashbacks then to an event in 1950 that they were all at. That's why we're saying like it's not specifically a 60s movie, because it's tackling current political situation in 1960 for the characters, but it flashes back to a lot of activism and actions they took in 1950. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but that's.
Well, no, we should talk about the filmmaking, because the filmmaking is amazing, and.
Well, we do, but I wanted to ask you one more political question before we go into it, because I think I hit pause on this movie at about like the 5 or 6 minute mark, and I'll confess I cheated with just some quick Wikipedia readings of what they were talking about.
Oh yeah, this is
this movie.
This is basically a classical Marxist, or like Third International. That would be the one that comes out of the Soviet Union, Marxist debating club. Functionally, that's what this movie is.
It really is. It's dialogue heavy. You're reading a lot of subtitles, which I love doing, but I did pause it a bunch because I was like, I need more context. Wait, what does that mean then? And so it is one of those that you're going to want to watch a few times. I plan on watching it several more times because that description doesn't express how filmic this is though either.
Yes.
because it is just a debate club scenes, but it is so expertly photographed and captured with the cinematography, but it's also just visually striking in how it transitions between the time periods and how it films the different time periods as well. Do you think though, like the politically speaking for all of Japan, Isaac, do you think this is politically something that came about as seeking a new political identity post World War II for the youth in Japan?
Well, I think part of it is that I don't actually know enough about the history of the Japanese left. A lot of what they keep talking about is, so this switches between two major points in which the student movement is mobilizing to prevent treaties, either the initial self-defense treaty in like 1950, 1951, and then I guess I can't remember the exact treaty. It's another basing treaty in 1960. And so you have two different generations of activists showing the transition from the communist dominated from the 1951, which is the communist dominated one, and all of the sins that come out of that. And when I say communist, I mean the Stalinist. Dominated by that. I mean, a part of what it cycles around is the death of this committing suicide, one of the students, driven to it by the opportunism and the cravenness of the sort of student Stalinist bureaucracy that's helping to lead this movement.
Right. Well, the treaty that we're talking about too is like it's with the United States, which there's clearly some sentiment of like, fuck that.
So I think this is the movie where we get an opportunity to just sort of representative of sort of political content in Japanese movies in this period. From what I've seen, is the omnipresence of the United States. And there's movies where it's much more, but it's that it does. Their cause is the cause of peace, right, and getting out of the way of American imperialism post-war. Mm-hmm. But this is a generation of activists. I mean, the students from the 1950s would have experienced the war, right, as conscious individuals, as teenagers, and may have even been partially on the left during the period of authoritarianism. So democracy is very important to them. At the same time, their movement is profoundly undemocratic.
Yeah, a bit.
So I think, in terms of I think part of it is that every country moves by its own political timeline, and this fits the Japanese timeline, which does not necessarily fit, the entire global left at the same time that there are connections, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's actually answering your question.
I mean, it was more just a bit. I mean, I didn't expect you to speak for like all of the Japanese new left there, but it has a sense to me of reconciling, because like in the 1950s segments when they're active as students protesting against this treaty with the United States, there's good cause for that, and there's a certain amount of just like, that's the country that dropped 2 atomic bombs on us. What the fuck are we doing here? And like, there's also it seems to me that in the movie, the way it represents it, there's a feeling of that country is going to talk about peace. Come on.
I think that's part of it, which of course, to be honest, is in our next movie, we're going to deal with the crimes of Japan in World War II.
Right, which are there, but in this case, it's more it's so laser focused on this. I got it right here in my notes. The AMPO treaty, and the demonstrations that took place, at which the bride and groom in the current 1960 timeline in this film met there.
Right,
which is why it's bringing all these wounds, from what happened during the 1950s student activist movement are coming to the surface in 1960 at this wedding.
Which, part of it is also is that, they represent 2 generations, right? She's from the new wave. He's from the old wave. He was in the leadership of the old wave, but also was partially outside of it because he wasn't technically a party member, which is how you actually got into the inside. And then there's a younger activist from the new wave who also disappeared, and there's issues there. I mean, part of the other thing that this movie is about, which if you were involved in activism before this point that we're in right now, I mean, if you're not from this sort of post-Bernie wave or even the Obama era wave, but basically anything from about 1968 onward, you will know this, where there's the costs. You're being beaten and beaten and beaten. I mean, there's a part of when the controversies around the new wave of activism, which is centered around these famous protests that happen at the Japanese Parliament in which a woman is actually killed by the police, and people are being brutalized and injured. They're in the hospital. That's where the scenes are actually at. It's it's and the woman who actually becomes the bride is telling the activist who she's brought into this that, look, no, we were never going to win. We never thought we were going to win. The point is that we're there and that we're I mean, it's a very familiar thing for people for leftists who have the experience of being beaten over and over and over again, and you're still trying to figure out a reason to go on. I mean, the context of both of these movements is that they lost. And they were not able to prevent these things, and how devastating that is, and how much damage that does to you and your ability to go on, and how distorting that is the politics. And we can't get in. We would have to go back and pick out every strand because it's detailed done, the reactions to those losses.
It really is. There was actually even a few specific lines of dialogue I wrote down in my notes because, again, it's a work of art representing this movement. This isn't a documentary of it. God, I actually even thought about how maybe this might be comparable to like a Z or Battle of Algiers. Like this is like a canon political film or political treatise as like film text almost. It's really, really fascinating to me. Yep. There was a line I wrote down where I was like, holy shit, like that rings true to, I mean, and this is, again, this movie is so specifically grounded in actual reality that activists experience in Japan in this time period. But I think what makes it a great work of art is that you can pull out little like certain lines or observations where like, well, shit, that rings true even to this day. I wrote down one that was, remember the amount of public outrage in June? It dissipated as the protests were dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, well, that really rings true for, and they were talking very specifically about the protests, in the context of this film. But I was like, well, that's interesting. Like, how do you keep it going if you're not, if the protests are dispersed?
The entire, I mean, I think, well, it gets at those dynamics in a way that rings true because I think it's pretty clear the director knows what he's talking about. It rings very true for those feelings. I mean, part of it is, I think in our context, we have no idea where the protests are going and they're not over. And they weren't really defeated. It's just, we're in a complex moment. We're in an absurd moment, but it does ring with these mass protest moments. And I think this focuses on the student movement. From what I've read about the protests in this period, they are much more widespread than that.
Yeah.
But part of it is, I mean, the sheer level. The other thing that rings really true is the sheer level and I think it's not nearly this bad anymore. Certainly on the American left, but of this hyper abstract academic. Have you ever done at campus organizing? Look, the students are the future, and there's amazing, brilliant campus organizing that happens.
Yeah.
Oh God, it can be so full of shit. One, because it's so abstracted from what's actually going on in the real world, which I think American students nowadays can't do that because they've got student debt and they actually have to work and they're really fucked up.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But these students are not that. And there's this question of like, well, we're Marxists, but we're totally abstracted from the workers' movement. The workers' movement happens through the Communist Party. The Communist Party controls you, but sort of lords over the fact that you're not actually part of the workers' movement. And they never really, they sort of grapple with, but never actually deal with the fact that they're not tying to the masses. They're just, we're the vanguard. It's vanguardism. But you're actually isolated from the broader movements, and you don't know how to actually organize your way out of it. You just know how to street fight until you're exhausted, and that's really recognizable too. They just don't.
Well, there's even a scene where I don't think it's at the wedding, but there's even a scene where it's like a break off little like book club, like salon style, like academic discussion going on. That's completely separate from the plot and the other group of characters, which I think kind of visually represents what you're talking about there. There's like academics off in their own little bubble that are discussing, wild ideas of philosophy and theory, which are completely valid and worth exploring. And the dynamic is that there's other characters that are just totally ready to like, let's take up the arms and let's just, hit the streets and do what we got to do.
There's what is there anything more to say about like just the filmmaking? I mean,
there's. I was trying to figure out like comparative films to get listeners to kind of visualize this again film is a visual medium and we're in an audio medium, so there's that handicapping of the conversation here to a certain extent. The wedding scene itself is kind of a chamber drama. Like it's a finite set where everyone's around, and there's this film element where the camera, I guess I could compare it to like an Altman film. He'll use the camera in a way to do zooms and pans and find things that the audience should focus on, even if sometimes the action takes place off camera or there's muddled dialogue. And it gives it like a cinema verite kind of vibe here. This is sort of the opposite of that, where the wedding scene is in this finite set and it's packed full of people, and the camera leads the audience around the scene where, let's say, like the groom is talking, and then like the camera all of a sudden like, pans to the right and finds like this woman over here who has something to say. And it's done in a very orderly fashion, which I found to be really, really interesting. That it's long takes. It's not cutting from the groom to this person speaking to that person speaking to the fourth person speaking. It's a lot of long takes that is it's a very theatrical kind of staging. And the camera just, moves around and catches everybody. And so it's very rehearsed. It's very coordinated. It's very choreographed. But then the flashback scenes of student activism are almost done in a very abstract way, where it's a black background and then people acting out on what is clearly a set, and almost it's a Lars von Trier film called Manderley, or Dogville as well, where they did with Nicole Kidman. That one's probably a little bit more famous, where it's done in like this Our Town style set, the play, where like there's classically with Our Town, like there's no set to it at all. Like you're just on a bare stage. Mm. And the protest scenes, kind of actually violent as they are, like there's quite a bit of blood for a 1960s film, are done in almost, it's so weird because it's very theatrical in its staging, but it's also very filmic in its cinematography. I hope I'm describing it well. I feel like I'm missing some words here.
I know what you're talking about. I think we're having this problem with all these episodes because I think these are movies we watched that that we're going to watch again and again because there's just too much going on here. And they're also so deeply in their context that they're movies that if you want to take seriously, you have to work through those contexts, which takes time. Mm-hmm. So this is the first cut, I think, on trying to understand what's being done in all of these movies that we're looking at today. And I think that's definitely true with that. But I know what you're talking about, and I know the scenes you're talking about, and they struck me. I don't have the same eye for method as you, but for filmmaking style. But it's very clear that's there.
Well, let's hop back then into one more thing I wanted to talk about from this film specifically, more from a political and sociological angle, and that is the fact that they're at a wedding then that's what kicks off this whole thing. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of references politically to, actually one of the quotes I wrote down was, "How can you settle into the cage called family?" And there's really interesting accusations leveled at people. These are students from the movement and how they're settling into the family, and how that is counter to the purpose and the point of their activist movement. It's like family and marriage is looked on from some of the activists in this film as you've given up, you've surrendered the battle.
Right.
You're settling down.
Well, part of it is, I think part of it is, I mean, if you look at especially the leading communist apparatchik, who's now a leading figure in the party after being a leading figure in the communist student movement, if you look at him, right, marriage is sellout. Like, marriage is becoming respectable, but still within your movement. It also means that, you're not as dedicated. You're not giving your life to the movement. You're building something else. Now, part of what I reflect on is that, when you actually build movements and you're doing actual organizing, it's a long haul thing. It's not actually these sudden flourishes, and that deep dedication and giving yourself to the movement is really important. I mean, I've spent the last week doing almost nothing but activist work, which mainly just means Zoom meetings this week. I'm starting to feel it at this point.
It's what it is these days, though.
It is what it is. But also canvassing and everything. But part of it, like the way they're describing marriage, I mean, I think within the movie it's sort of selling out. I keep thinking, like, actually, that sounds like if you weren't, if this was actually genuine, which in some ways is not. it would actually be digging in for the long haul, right? You've got an activist couple and they're going to keep going, but they're not going to burn out completely because all these people are going to burn out, right? Every single one of them is going to burn out with the rate that they already are. That's part of the point of the movie.
Right. So as you were speaking to like film elements here, I think I have a decent way to wrap this up, but also address kind of visually what we're talking about with this film. Because my fear is that we're making it sound very stagey and talky and theatrical and not highly visual. Like, this is a highly visually engaging film. It just happens to have a lot of like really weighty, kind of, I don't know, like theory head kind of stuff going on throughout the conversations amongst the characters. But I think it does it in a very engaging way amongst all the characters. And this film also does speak to the equality that we mentioned at the top of the show with one of the elements of the Japanese New Wave was like, women's role within society. And there's like very strong and complex female characters throughout this film that definitely pass the Bechdel test, because most everyone is talking like wild theory and like really in-depth political analysis of stuff. They just happen to be doing it at a wedding for most of the film. The climax of this film, like when you think of climaxes to films, generally there's like, sweeping camera shots, there's like swelling music. It's a summarization, or it's the payoff for all the narrative threads that have been happening here. In this film, we should also say it does take place at a wedding, but it's a multi-character ensemble piece. Like, you get narrative arcs for several characters.
Right.
In this film. The climax of this film is actually this really long take where the camera just pans very quickly around the room at the wedding, where all of the characters that we just got all the backstory, the motivation, the desires, the aspirations, whether or not they came true or not, they all come in and they all have a final say at the wedding. And some of it is like ripping people apart. Some of it is revealing backstory that you're like, oh shit, that is going on there. There's affairs, there's backstabbing, there's things that are coming to light that other characters didn't know, there's revelations. And every like blurred pan shot as it goes around the wedding, and the camera's even moving quicker than it's moved the entire film. And again, it's all one long take. It really gives you this kind of feeling of like, every time the camera moves real quick in a blurry pan shot to the next character, like, what the fuck is the next revelation going to be? Like, it's very riveting. And I didn't even realize it was the climax until like afterwards, like the credits hit and you're like, oh yeah. No, like it feels like a climax, but not in a traditional sense, because it's expertly choreographed in cinematography, again, in like an all one take, but it's also narratively an amazing climax because it's the pinnacle of each character arc come to fruition in just this one scene at the wedding.
Well, I was thinking of not so much the climax as the final scene, where the younger activists have left to go off and help their comrade who's been arrested, like at the wedding, right? He gets
right, yeah.
He gets picked up at the wedding. He's a Trotskyist, so he's been laying into the old generation the whole time. Yep. I mean, there's actually some really good political strategy discussion in this movie. And the party apparatchik guy who I've mentioned, who's who went from a student movement to, starts droning on about why we're not supporting them, why we're letting them go off and get arrested, why we're not going to back their adventurism, and blah, 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 blah. And it's all the jargon. It's like nothing has changed for him through this, all these revelations, all this stuff about like people literally committing suicide because of things he's done. Nothing has changed. And everyone else in the wedding party is just staring at him. And the way I read that, they're staring at him in horror.
Yeah.
That after all of this, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you read it differently, but they're staring at him. I read it as staring in horror that after all of this, none of it has made a difference.
Right. And you don't get it.
You don't understand what's happened here.
Yeah. No, I did read that too. Yeah. I just, visually though, I like an all one take climax for each character arc that's going on at this wedding was just like visually like the cherry on top for this movie. Of the visual prowess that has been going on with the acting, the cinematography, the screenwriting, the character development, it all like just pops in this one last long take whip pan scene at the wedding.
Yeah.
Not that it's the last scene of the movie, but it's a different style of climax to a film that I was just blown away by.
Yep.
So that's Oshima's film from 1960, Night and Fog in Japan. Hopefully that was enticing to you. I don't know, like it's one of those movies that it's hard to just, you can't do a quick summary of it. You can't, there's so much to it. Like you got to sink your teeth into it. Sit down, do a little reading, watch it a couple times. It's definitely rewarding.
Yep.
Let's flash cut to 8 years later. He releases Death by Hanging. Again, we're going to lean on IMDb. The quick synopsis is a Korean man is sentenced to death by hanging, but he survives the execution. For the following 2 hours, his executioners try to work out how to handle the situation. I feel like that actually does lend itself to a quick synopsis, this film, because that is what happens.
Is it what happens? I don't think that's what happens. I mean, that is what happens.
I mean, it's literally what happens in the plot. I would say ... comedy ensues, which is not what you'd expect from that sentence.
Dark
from that
comedy,
description.
contemplations on the legacies of Japanese colonialism and racism toward Koreans specifically, and their 600,000 strong Korean population, which primarily was actually forced to go there by practically as slave labor, as well as deep contemplations about the nature of self of a mass rapist murderer who we're also led to sympathize with as somebody discriminated against, facing intensive racism as a Korean in Japan.
Right.
All through a practically Buñuel style dreamscape level weirdness.
Yeah, which is to say nothing of commentary on the death penalty, the role of religion and the power of religion, and I would argue superstitious beliefs within a society. Told, like a Buñuel kind of, Bertolt Brecht kind of reminding you that there's a lot of distancing effects in the narrative too that just remind you that like you're watching an absurd movie and situation play out in the darkest possible satire. I think just because we're going through the 60s, I really kept thinking of Dr. Strangelove a lot in this film while I was watching it, because it's so self-serious in every single scene, and the actors are not playing it for laughs the way that you'd see like a Mel Brooks film or something. Like it's not a traditional comedy that's just like, oh look, we're doing comedy. They are very serious about the roles they're playing. Well, I mean, which I feel like is what gives Dr. Strangelove its bite.
I mean, that's just it. It's like they're very serious and yet they're absolutely absurd as they play act their way through trying to convince a murderer that of who he is so that they can execute him, because they can't execute him if he doesn't know who he is. If he's not of sound mind, you can't execute him. So we have to convince him of his sound mind and that he is who he is so that we can kill him by literally reenacting with each other the crimes that he committed, to the point at which it becomes fairly clear that some of them are perfectly capable of committing those crimes. And then eventually, when they're sitting there drunk in what is potentially a scene that didn't actually happen at all, it's not clear where the dreams, where the guy's mind ends at a certain point and where it begins. You find out all the horrific things that they did during the war, and that when they're drunk, they might just want to kill all of the Koreans. I know, I just, this is the thing is, the only way I can deal with this movie is just like blurting it all out. It's just like, I mean, part of what's interesting, I mean, just, I wonder how this, so the Japanese New Left is affected by, and it is not just, cannot be attributed to simply, but, is definitely affected by the anti-racist struggles and post-colonial struggles of the 60s. And I wonder how much that as a thematic, because Japanese racism, like they basically go through like an almost forensic detail of by demonstrating the different racist stereotypes of Koreans.
Yeah. And
one of the things that hit me, I think those of us in a Western audience don't really completely understand. It's like, no, I mean, I can't remember actually when Japan conquered Korea, the entire Korea Peninsula. It might have been, I don't know if it's the late 19th century or early 20th, but they colonized, and there's actually a number of recent, very, very good, like The Handmaiden, South Korean movies dealing with the Japanese legacy, but they colonized and attempt to eliminate Korean culture. This is not, and Japanese colonialism, especially in China, leads to the deaths of tens of millions of people. This is not minor. It's
right.
There's very few European powers that actually are responsible for. I mean, there are definitely as much mayhem or as much destruction, and this is the first movie that we looked at, or we actually have the ones that we looked through of these 60s movies where they're taking this head on, and it's kind of agonizing when you deal with it, and that parallels it with the European movies that we've been talking about, where there's this realization that no, your society is full of war criminals.
Right.
You know.
No, you're right. It's internet says 1910 until 1945. Yes. It was considered a part of Japan until 1945.
Right. It's always
fresh. It's very fresh at this point.
It's incredibly fresh, and you have this population that is there because of, if I remember correctly, but I believe most of the Korean population were forced labor brought there to Japan, and I think that's said in the movie. I mean, there's points that are done through the dreamscape of a semi-incestuous, not real sister for our killer character, talking once again sort of in political lecture style. So this is the commonality, I think, with our previous film about Korean identity and vis-a-vis Japan and the anger and hatred that comes out of this.
I kind of want to double back to the idea that, like, the main central part of the narrative that propels the whole thing forward is there's a death penalty argument here, which I find really kind of interesting. And I wasn't expecting, well, first of all, I wasn't expecting comedy with this movie at all. I'd heard that it was an amazing film. I knew of the director. I knew it's like one of the classics that he had made, and it was on Criterion, and it's called Death by Hanging. I was ready for an intense drama. And within the first, I think I told you previous to recording, within the first few minutes, I was like, okay, because it starts off almost like a documentary. Like, here's what the death penalty is like. Here's the place in the prison where the state kills people, blah, blah, blah. And he goes through and was like, okay. And then within like 20 minutes or so, I had to pause and just like kind of recalibrate, because I was like, this is cracking me up. What's going on here? And once I kind of settled in and realized it was a comedy, the central premise of the comedy to it is that the point of the death penalty is actually that the person being executed realizes why they're being executed and accepts the punishment for their crime. So there's no point in executing someone without them being a willful participant in this act so that you learned your lesson. And I was like, who gives a shit? Like, they're dead in a moment anyway. Like, what? So it's almost the satisfaction of those who remain living that someone learned their lesson.
Well,
at the moment of their death.
Part of the key,
and when he because so the main character is R. That's how they call him, is R. So when R survives his first hanging and then doesn't think he's R anymore, he doesn't think he's himself, and then he thinks R is a separate person from himself. Like, they can't just re-kill him. One, because there's like these weird religious grounds of like, well, I already saved his soul, so like the soul's already departed. You can't just kill this guy again.
That's only the pastor who believes that. So the pastor,
I know, but it's still in there.
Yeah, no, but the part of it is the pastor. The pastor is playing the other side of this the whole time, trying to save him now because this has already happened. This doesn't need to happen. You guys are horrific and immoral. While everybody else is going like, let's just figure out how to kill him by convincing him. That
you need, like, first he's unconscious but alive, and like, bring him back to life so we can kill him. You're like, yeah, that's when the absurdity kicks off. But yeah, the idea that like you have to have the person be a participant in their own execution is specifically not American, I guess.
I think so, yeah.
Which I might know part of, but yeah.
Part of what's interesting is, well, yeah, I mean, this podcast is against the death penalty, but in every country.
Yeah, controversial stance, I guess, but
part of what the key, I think, to a lot of that is at the very end of the movie. So the highest ranking official, this is also a great satire of the Japanese bureaucracy and the fecklessness and the passing the buck. I mean, it's great. You do feel the Dr. Strangeloveness of it, but there's other things in there as well. But you've had the prosecutor, who is the highest ranking person in the room, right? Who's like, actually genuinely powerful and may end up with a ministerial post in a government in the future. He basically doesn't talk through the movie, which is a perfect position for a stuffed suit to take. But at the very end, he directly gets involved to convince him to allow himself to die. And there's an entire discussion about what is the nature of a nation. And, part of it is that R has basically deconstructs, you're murdering me. You're murdering me. And he basically says, what is the nation? The nation is invisible, which weirdly echoes Benedict Anderson's, which is a book that came out after, Imagined Communities, which is the classic work on the history of the nation state, which refers to nations as an imagined community, because you don't know everybody in your nation, but you consider yourself to be part of a body of the whole. And he's basically challenging the very right of the nation to exist and judge him that this is still murder and that you all are murdering. And they're like, well, we represent the body of the law and the law is the nation or whatever. I can't actually get the formulation quite. It's a really, this is the other point where they're like straight up doing a political track.
Yeah.
And he, basically says, I don't believe I'm guilty. And the prosecutor says, okay, you can leave. And you're like, oh, okay, what's going to happen? And he walks through the door.
Is that the one where like he opens the door and then it's like that intense, like it's like a burst of light?
Yes.
From outside? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
You should.
No, that was an interesting scene because like no, your imagined community thing is fucking with my head right now actually, because like that's a really interesting concept that I was unaware of, or as far as like an academic thought, I guess. But that scene did seem like oddly kind of surreal to me. The way the rest of the film didn't seem like it functioned in that same tone. Not that it was off-putting or anything, but it was a really kind of like seemed like a scene from left field for me.
Yeah, I mean, basically, part of it is that the prosecutor then brings down the law of this is what the nation is, and that now you understand why you must die for this. And no, I think it is a different scene than the rest of the film, and I think it does bring a different power and a different argument. There's multiple different political arguments. Like this is once again a film as political tract on a very different subject than our previous film, and then is the previous film of his that we talked about. But it brings home a critique of the nation, of the absurdity of the death. Well, by critiquing the very existence of the Japanese race and nation, right? Because this is a critique of racism, and it's a critique of not nationalism per se, but of the nation, and also of the pretenses to any form of morality, because this is a room full of mass murderers, because they all took part in the Japanese conquest. And
are also just waiting to kill someone legally.
They're waiting to kill somebody legally in the most bureaucratic but weird way, in which they're all, especially there's the particular character of the director of education, I guess, in the prison. And he's the one who's supposed to communicate this stuff. And there's a certain point in the imagined world where he literally, while reenacting to try to convince R that he's committed these murders, kills the girl, imagined girl that R killed, and then really believes that he did it, and that leads into a whole other set of sequences, which aren't, you got to watch the movie. It's when it gets real wild. But part of what you realize is he's completely capable of doing this stuff. This is something I'm going to just really screw with just to say that the gender politics of both this movie and I think
Night and Fog in Japan.
Oh, Night and Fog in Night and Fog in Japan, you get a feeling that that Oshima is very, very well aware of sexism and its effects and how it works in the male mind. Because we didn't really bring this up, but part of there's a huge amount of sort of gender politics and use of sexism for political purposes within Night and Fog in Japan. And in this film, these guys are downright creepy when they're describing his sexual violence, the sexual violence that R commits before committing his murders.
Which is in the context, though, of in that particular scene, is they're trying to get him to realize who he is and what he did. So they're just like reading his file to him, like his permanent record, I guess, whatever, like the docket of what his crimes were. And then they start like kind of play acting it out. And it just gets more and more absurd because they're trying to get him to remember who he is and what he did. And it's done in pretty graphic like wording, like talking about what he did and all that, trying to get him to just like snap out of it, man. You need to admit to what you did. And people take over different play acting roles to like, it's like this is your life, like reenactments that they're trying to get him to snap out of it.
Well,
realize who he is and then accept his fate again.
There's real physical comedy watching grown middle-aged men, and this is going to sound as bad as it is, attempt to reenact a rape.
Yeah.
But like it never gets graphic. They're just really uncomfortable, but it's more like less uncomfortable with the act of the sexual violence, as opposed to that, oh, I have to play the role of a woman, or I just haven't really been able to put myself in this mindset exactly. But it's like, it's very clear that they actually have trouble defining what rape is, which is not that hard.
That's very true. Yeah. Well, even one guy too, and he's like, hey, can you do this part? And he was like, well, if it's for work, I guess I can do it. And you're like, wait, what? It's it's absurd, and it points to the it's another one of those examples of you can get away with a lot more sometimes if it's done comedically than if you're trying to do it dramatically. Although from the stuff that we've just scratched the surface of barely in Japanese films in this time period, I could easily see this being done as a drama and doing this whole thing from a very dramatic point of view, or from a dramatic spin rather than a comedic spin.
Yes. Oh, well, that's a part of it is this. I mean, I think you read it more of a comedy than I read it as a farce, but there's large swaths of it that it's comic almost, but it's such dark comedy, or it's absurdity. I mean, everything in our serial killer's mind where he's sort of contemplating through what it means to be self and how he sees his murders and how detached he is, and then how that ties to Korean identity. I mean, I think this is something you pointed out before we call is like they choose someone who's done horrible things to make the argument against the death penalty. That's
right.
They do not choose. He's not innocent, and he's done bad things, and they make arguments to justify that, which are both very powerful and also deeply troubling.
Well, I mean, I know it's based on an actual. It's inspired by, I guess, an actual Korean who in 1958 murdered 2 Japanese schoolgirls. But yeah, I was saying like that again. My brain, just because I've studied more American films than not, I guess I'm going back to like, well, in Hollywood, this would be somebody who's like wrongfully accused of murder, and that would place the audience's sympathies with that character. And I think it just speaks to the power of Oshima as an artist and as a filmmaker, that like this guy's, in the context of the story, like he's guilty, he raped and murdered 2 people. The audience should not be on his side, but he is the audience character going through this particular story. And I'm not like cheering. I'm just against the death penalty. So I'm like, well, wait, I don't think we need to kill this guy. And then the absurdity of like, he's hung and then survives kind of places you in his corner, because everyone else is around him is just so absurd of a character.
Well,
that he kind of ends up being the audience surrogate in this plot.
He's the only one we see into who he is. I mean, part of it, we because we look deeply into his psyche and his motivations, and there's even some degree of justification. I don't think the movie is actually saying that what he did was right, but they're contextualizing. So much of the movie is contextualizing him socially, part of him, his social condition and the racism and how that's affected the basically structural racism which has led to him growing up in poverty and all sorts of things.
Right.
Part of what when they're going through the fantasy sequences where they're playing pretend to try to convince him, part of what it is they have their lurid fantasies of what these things are supposed to be, and they are consistently wrong as to what's actually driving him.
Uh-huh.
Because when he actually describes what's driving him, it's very different. They have this, basically, you had a lustful moment and you went for it, or whatever, right? Which is part of it, is that's what they do. They think about female body parts and then I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
He's not thinking like that. Him, it's this deep detachment and loneliness and really not being able to connect with humanity.
I was going to say, when you said he was the kind of character we get the most, or we kind of get to know the most, which is true, but I think that through his story and through the characters trying to jog his memory to get him to realize, like, you are convicted, we need to murder you, you need to confess, you need to accept what you did so that we can feel comfortable killing you. I think it actually says a lot, and it explores a lot within the host of characters that run the prison that are trying to put this man to death. I think it actually does say a lot about their characters as well. You don't get to know like their full backstory of like, home life, how they were raised, the environment, the socioeconomic status of these characters, but you see a lot of what their psyche is like based on how they react to R and the current situation that they find themselves in, trying to get him to realize like, hey, who you are and accept this and everything else, so that we can finally put you to death. So I think you do get in a weird kind of like obtuse way, get into the psyche of all these other characters and how they're reacting to the situation. It says a lot about them as well. It's kind of non-traditional character development, but I think there's a lot of interesting character development done through this, like you said, Boonwell, like surrealist kind of plot, which is not actually how the filmmaking goes. The filmmaking is actually pretty straightforward. And just because we were talking about him on a previous episode, when the film Failsafe came up, I think on our last 1964 episode, when we were talking about Sidney Lumet and the pawnbroker, this, for the first half of the movie, all taking place in like the hanging chamber, of the prison where they're trying to kill R, it kind of felt like Failsafe. It's a very claustrophobic, one set film.
Right.
And then it opens up a little bit in the long run, but it's, again, black and white, kind of all in one location, chamber satire.
Well, that's actually, I was
drama.
thinking of Exterminating Angel during the first half of the movie.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And the second half of the movie, it gets a little out of that, because they leave the building, but they don't leave the building.
Oh, that's true too. Yeah.
So it sort of leaves that space. But that first half, you definitely get the sense of like, we're going to be trapped in this space for the whole time with these crazy people.
Yeah.
With these farces of society.
Yeah. And again, it has that very like Brechtian kind of theater of the absurd kind of presentation as well, which was a thing we mentioned too, just because, everything doubles back and this is all sort of the same time period. Very much in the realm of, like, we were talking about Agnes Varda, the theater troupe that she worked with as a professional photographer before making her first films. Brecht and the theater of the absurd, like that was a brand new movement that was going on in the 60s that, made its way to Japan by 68 and was clearly infused Oshima as they were putting together the script for this, which he did help co-write and then direct. And set the tone, I think, for this film in general. But I feel like this movie is also very unique because again, we're just scratching the surface. I'd be very curious to see what other comedies, not even if it doesn't have to be associated with theater of the absurd or anything like that, or maybe just what other comedic tones were going on in the Japanese New Wave here. I'm going to be diving a little bit deeper in to try to figure that out in the future, because I'm fascinated by this one. Like, the tone of it is so unique and not at all what I thought I was in for. It caught me by surprise, and I'm very interested to dive a little bit deeper into Japanese comedy at this time period.
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you, you can, just not even just sort of like new wave in terms of art films, but there's just in some of the gangster movies I've watched, there's a really goofy, there's no fear of being goofy, which I think I've noticed in sort of Japanese film in general and anime and a lot of things, at the same time that it's being goofy about really violent things.
Okay.
It's I think you'll find it interesting.
Okay.
Where they're willing to go.
No, I do find that interesting because, one, like as we mentioned before, you can just get away with a lot more stuff sometimes if you make it funny. But also the sensibilities and even in contemporary foreign films, foreign from a American perspective, like Danish films, like the comedic sensibilities that will pop up, even if it's not a comedy, you're like, that's kind of out of left field. And I think it's because other countries, sometimes their national cinemas are more comfortable mixing genres than you get coming out of Hollywood. Like, it's a comedy, it's a drama, it's a mystery, and overlapping the genres doesn't happen as often here in Hollywood, especially throughout the long history of Hollywood. And other countries just seem much more skilled and open to having comedic elements in dramas or vice versa, and overlapping genres a little bit more interesting. So
right.
Looking forward to exploring a lot more 60s, specifically 60s Japanese film, because wow. So yeah, 3 strong recommendations coming. I mean, at least 3. We've got Branded to Kill. You've got Night and Fog in Japan and Death by Hanging. Like we said, go to Criterion Channel, just sort it by 1960s is the decade and Japan is the country. and you've got 121 films to pick from. I feel like if you just spun the wheel at random, you're going to find something pretty interesting.
Right. I mean, I'm just going to throw out See, Kill.
Do it.
See, Kill. See, so we've mentioned a couple of them. Colt is My Passport. See,
you said Pigs and Battleships.
Pigs and Battleships. See Black Lizard, which is super weird. I mean, there's just, you kind of can't miss. All right. One that actually did miss that I watched recently, I watched Genocide, which is way too weighty. I'm just going to just spoil it. The bugs decide to murder us all because we might start a nuclear war and they don't want to die in it too, which is both completely understandable and justified. I'm kind of on the bugs. I kind of get it. Like, I don't blame all of humanity for like nuclear weapons, but like, if you're an insect, can you really tell the difference? Fair.
So sort of the way I was saying that I was cheering for the birds and the birds on a previous episode, because
like
you're saying you cheer for the bugs in that one?
I kind of cheer for the bugs. It also involves tie-ins with, I mean, speaking of problematic, the main villainess is a Holocaust survivor who's decided that humanity needs to die, so she's cultivating the bugs. And the U.S. the most interesting thing about it is if you want to sort of see a Japanese perspective on the U.S. as functionally a colonial power, because the U.S. this U.S. soldiers there basically just completely ignore Japanese law and everything there. It's interesting, but it's not that great a movie. But if you're looking for a schlocky horror movie, which obviously any Godzilla will do, that's also another one. And if you want to see the bugs try to kill us all, which is like, yeah.
All right. So we are going to head back to Hollywood on our next episode. We're going year by year through the 60s. We're up to 1965. And each year we're kind of doing if you've listened to any of the other episodes, you know the format. If you haven't, we do a little bit of the political and societal context for it. We do a little bit of the Hollywood context, mentioning a few other films and what the general Hollywood zeitgeist was. But each episode we focus in on a few films to really kind of focus the conversation. 1965, we have selected, I would say, a pretty wide and straight up weird variety. But because I think it looks like to me 1955 is sort of a turning point year to a certain extent. So we're going to be looking specifically at Faster Pussycat, Kill Kill, which as of this recording, you could just watch for free on YouTube. We're also going to take a look at the Bedford incident, possibly capping off what were you calling the genre, Isaac?
The Cold War instability genre, which both involves McCarthyism, destroying American democracy, and nuclear war.
Right. And I am going to do a beach report on 1965 is the pinnacle. It's a very short-lived subgenre of beach film, generally looked at as like the Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello, although there's a bit more to it. So I'm going to do a beach report on that as a genre because it peaked and died in 1965. So I also wanted to mention too, we have been doing a lot of posting basically our show notes and links to watch stuff and things to keep an eye on our Twitter account. So check us out at Politics of Cinema on Twitter. And until next time, I am Aaron.
And I'm Isaac. Stay safe out there, whether you're protesting, whether you're trying to avoid the pandemic, whether you're trying to get the mail delivered. It's rough out there, but we're going to win.